You're listening to Explore by the Cycling Podcast, brought to you by iwoca. Flexible loans built for small businesses. iwoca.co.uk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore by the Cycling Podcast. I'm joined by Hannah Troop. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Lionel.
And by Ian Boswell. How are you, Ian?
I'm doing well, Lionel. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Yeah, I've been wondering, what have you both been up to over the last few weeks, cycling-wise?
We are now allowed outside cycling again here in Spain. So the last couple of weeks has been going up and down the Barcelona mountains because we were only allowed to the edge of the Barcelona border. And then this last week we were finally allowed outside of the Barcelona border. So I managed to do my first about 90k ride the other day in about 4 months, I think it must be. So it's starting to get good. Excellent.
How about you, Ian?
Yeah, I've been working away up here in northern Vermont, and actually we never had, I think on the last time I joined you, there was never a full lockdown here in Vermont. So the early days I wasn't riding outside all that much, but now that the weather has warmed and it feels like summertime, I've been doing a fair share of cycling outdoors, which feels great, especially now that the sun is shining and the roads aren't muddy. And
have you done an event recently as well?
I have not done an event per se. Well, I guess I have. So back in kind of before the Belgian waffle ride, I guess that was late April, Ted King started this DIY gravel project, which is essentially just people doing events that we were all supposed to attend from your home. So I did do a 200-mile Dirty Kanza by myself here in Vermont, and then a couple of days later I joined Ted King for a ride. He rode the whole state of Vermont, 312 miles. I joined him just for a handful of miles there. So that was fun. But it's looking like maybe come autumn that events will return to the calendar.
Well, for my part, I was riding our Giro over on the Cycling Podcast. We produced 23 episodes of the Cycling Podcast, all celebrating the history of the Giro d'Italia and the culture of Italy. And alongside that, we had a turbo training Grand Tour. We're claiming it as the first indoor Grand Tour because there were 21 stages. It was organised on the RGT cycling platform. Daniel Freeb designed the route. Every stage seemed to be brutally hard and finish uphill, and it was pretty tough. But I've come out of that hour Giro flying. I've been out on the road the last 6 or 7 days, and I use the term relatively. I don't want to overdo it here, but I feel like the constant effort of riding on a turbo trainer where you basically get no real rest, you're pedaling the whole time, it served me well. And as I've been getting out on the road, as the weather has been pretty good here in the UK, it's really kind of whetted my appetite for my next Explore challenge, which I'm hoping to do in July, but more of that in a future episode. What have we got coming up in this episode of Explore? Well, Hannah, you have interviewed author, bike courier turned Transcontinental winner Emily Chappell, and we'll hear that interview shortly. And Ian, you've spoken to somebody who's done even more indoor turbo training riding than I've been doing, someone who's been basically riding across America without leaving home, which is a pretty mind-boggling feat to try and undertake.
You're listening to Explore by the Cycling Podcast, brought to you by iwoca. Flexible loans built for small businesses. If you run a business, find out more at iwoca.co.uk. iwoca.co.uk.
Thank you very much to iwoca, our title sponsors, who came on board a little bit earlier this year and whose support directly enabled us to bring back Explore as a monthly show. iwoca are heavily involved in cycling because they also sponsor the Kendal Cycle Club, which is based on the edge of the Lake District in the northwest of England, a beautiful part of the country. There's a lovely video on the iwoca website actually called Why I Ride, and it features some business owners who are also members of the Kendal Cycle Club talking about how cycling improves their mental and physical health, which in turn helps them make better decisions for their businesses. And I think that's something we can all identify with. iwoca also has a Strava club, which you can join by going to the iwoca website. So if you're a small business owner and you want to connect with other people who share your passion for cycling, but who also might run a business similar to yours and have something in common with the ups and downs of your day-to-day working life, go and check it out at the iwoca website. The past few months have been extremely challenging for all small businesses, with the coronavirus crisis affecting absolutely everything that we do on a day-to-day basis. As Christoph, one of iwoca's founders, says on the website, there's now a bit of a tug of war going on between businesses which are trying to survive and plan for the future. Many suppliers need prompt payment for their goods and services, but buyers also need a bit more time to pay. So with this in mind, this week iwoca has launched iwoca Pay, which helps the supplier to get paid up front while the customer can spread the cost over 90 days. So it's a win for everyone all round, really. To find out more about iwoca Pay, go to iwoca.co.uk. That's iwoca.co.uk. Just before we hear your interview with Emily Chappell, Hannah, should just mention that the Cycling Podcast has got some new kit which will be available very soon. It's available to pre-order now from the cyclingpodcast.com/shop, and it's our collaboration with Katusha. Ian, you of course rode for the Katusha team, and I assume would have worn the Katusha kit.
Yeah, I did. I still have a couple articles of Katusha kit that I, especially the winter stuff. Yeah, it's fantastic stuff, and it was an honor to be able to wear that stuff for the 2 years when I was on the team. It's they've come a long way in the last couple of years in making some very premium cycling kit. Well,
the jersey and the t-shirt available in both men's and women's cuts, and as I say, you can pre-order them now at thecyclingpodcast.com/shop. So Hannah, your assignment this month was to interview Emily Chappell. For those who aren't aware of who Emily is, perhaps you can give us a little introduction.
Yeah, so, well, firstly, Lionel, I want to say congratulations, actually, for your Turbo Giro. Interesting how Daniel Freeb manages to design a course when he's not going to do it and make it incredibly hard for you all, but there you go. So, so I had a chat with Emily Chappell this last month, and it was such a great to speak to her, actually, a great chat with her. She's a very interesting character. She originally moved to London and was doing a master's there, and she became a bike courier and was very much involved in that scene. And she decided to write a book. Her first book was called What Goes Around, a London Cycle Courier's Story. And it basically talks about that kind of like almost underworld kind of cycling scene that was there in London. But then she kind of then decided to kind of realize she was riding 300 miles a week as a courier, and decided like how far she could ride, and started riding out of London and just seeing how far like a bike and her own sort of pedal power could take her. And she eventually got to the point where she was doing so many long distance riding events. The Transcontinental kind of started to pique her interest, as people who get into this kind of long endurance rides it kind of does. And so she kind of decided to set out upon trying to do that, take on that race. And like so many of these people who take on that race, they have their problems of not being able to complete it, their failures and their successes. And so after riding the race, she actually, the second time she rode it, she won it as the first female. And she's just written a book that came out late last year called Where There's a Will, Hope, Grief and Endurance in a Cycle Race Across a Continent. And so I just spoke to her about what it was like to ride that race. And yeah, it was quite incredible to hear her story. So you started into the cycling world. For people who don't really know your background, you started into the cycling world by being in London and becoming a bike courier. Can you just explain why there was the move to London for a start, and then how you decided to get into couriering?
It's a bit weird, isn't it? I've been thinking only recently that I did it completely the wrong way around. So I grew up in Mid Wales, which is one of the best places in the UK for road cycling. incredible hills, beautiful landscapes, very quiet roads, good tarmac. And I almost never cycled there. It just wasn't part of my life. And it was only when I moved to London after university, just, because I had to do something. I had no plan whatsoever. It was then that I got into cycling. And my first few years of being into cycling and, commuting and then, hanging out with fixies a lot and then getting into couriering, it was all in London. That's where I fell in love with it. And now I go back to London and I do still enjoy riding around. I kind of plug into the old magic in some ways. But I also think this is a rubbish place to cycle. How did I become an obsessive cyclist living here? I didn't even discover getting out of the city in any meaningful way until I'd been at it for a good 5 years. So yeah, I got into couriering because I finished my second degree during a recession, and none of the jobs I went for came to anything. They all kind of dried up as I was applying for them. And yeah, being a courier was the only job I could get. I'd always secretly wanted to have a go because I thought couriers were really cool, as everyone does. And then I think that was it. I just sort of stepped onto that conveyor belt, got really, really into couriering, got better and better at it. And then once I felt I'd mastered that, I needed something else. And I was starting to think, I wonder if I went out of London, because I'm riding hundreds of miles a week in this very small circle of, one of the biggest cities in the world. I'm sure there is more than this. I wonder what else I could do, where else I could go. And so that led me to do, so I cycled across Asia. And then ever since then, I've just been thinking, right, well, where else could I go? What else could I do? How much harder could I push? How much further could I go? And that inevitably led me to racing.
What is the courier scene like? Because I remember when I lived in London, I remember working around like Leather Lane and seeing like some of the couriers hanging out around some of the like shops and the cafes around there. And it definitely is a real kind of scene within London. Like, how would you best describe that scene? And then when you started to tell those people what you were trying to do by the longer endurance, like how was their reaction to it as well?
Well, with the caveat that I've not done it for a few years. So I speak for the courier scene of 5 years ago or more. And I think it's probably very different now. So I left before all of the Deliveroo and Uber Eats and things started. So I don't really know what it would be like these days. But back then, it was interesting in terms of scene, because I think to the outsider, it looked like there was a very cohesive, gang, and we all got together and hung out. But in reality, as always, it was much, much more complicated. Like, couriers there are certain types, obviously, but there are quite a few different types. And there are also just loads and loads of different people doing it from like different ages and backgrounds and doing it for different reasons and all of that. A lot of people do it as their job, as their career. Also, a lot of people do it as a sort of transitory thing while they, do some training or do a qualification or find their feet in another career. A lot of people have some sort of side gig going on. And yeah, so there would have been that scene. There were various other scenes as well, outside of the bars and cafes around town, and in the evenings and in various squats and events and things at the weekends. And in terms of what they thought, everyone just thought it was really cool. I got quite a few couriers had done things like that. So there were a few people I got some really good advice from, and there were people who'd been, touring in the 1980s and 90s, back when it was very different. And then when I got back from that first tour, that I got the deal to write the book, my first book, What Goes Around, about being a cycle courier in London. And I was a little bit nervous about that, because I'd been saying for years that I don't think someone could or should write the book about being a cycle courier in London, because it's such a diverse thing. There are so many different people. There should be different voices. It should be an anthology. And I said this, and I used to have a blog about being a courier. So every now and then someone would say, oh, why don't you write a book? I'd say, no, an anthology would be the only way to go. And then I got a book deal. I thought, okay, right, well, I'll write a book about me. And I thought everybody else would say, who does she think she is, swanning in here and writing a book about our scene? And in reality, they were all bowled over and incredibly proud, or at least anyone who spoke to me was. I think as soon as it was announced in the bookseller, someone knew about it. And I thought, what are couriers doing reading the bookseller? But, they did. And yeah, people just kept coming up and, saying they were pleased and congratulating me. And quite a few people came to the launch. And yeah, it was great. I think I'd always assumed that I wouldn't fit in because I assume that about any scene I'm meant to be part of. But in reality, I think they thought I was one of their own and they were proud of me.
Yeah. And so then you went over to Asia. Why was Asia your first place? Was that to do because you studied South Asian literature, didn't you? Am I right in thinking that? So was that like a reason for why you went over there?
Well, the Asia thing was originally a plan to cycle around the world, and Asia was the first chunk. So I left the UK and went east. I think also, so I've spent quite a lot of time in India and Pakistan, and it was nice to go back to that part of the world. It was unlike a lot of people as they go across Asia. So it becomes, to your average European, less and less familiar. So first of all, you leave behind a predominantly Christian part of the world, and then you move into the Muslim world. And there were a few really cool bits where sort of you'd be camping one night in somewhere in the Balkans and you'd hear church bells in the morning. And the next morning you'd be woken up by mosques around you. And that was really cool. But I was slightly more familiar with that. And then for a lot of people, it's a big jump when they get into somewhere like Iran and the script is different. And suddenly you can't understand things. But because I could read Arabic script, I don't speak Farsi, but I could at least spell out what was happening. It was a little bit less of a blow for me. And then when I crossed into Pakistan, I felt like I was coming home. So it was actually quite a nice way of doing it, because there was a lot that was strange and unfamiliar, but there was these little pockets of comfort and familiarity and places I had friends and all of that. And then I went into China and everything felt completely alien because I had very little experience of Chinese culture. And in hindsight, I didn't do as well in China, and I feel I didn't do China justice because of that. I think it seems to me quite a shame now that I spent quite a lot of time in China having not done years and years of homework and done degrees in Chinese literature and learned more of the language. So I think having some prior knowledge, or even having quite a lot of prior knowledge of where you're traveling, really helps with how much you get out of it and how you engage with the places you visit. China's just too big, really, to cycle across. So I spent the first 2 months there just steadily making progress. And then I had to update my visa, and they wouldn't give me more than 15 days. And I still had 1,000 miles or more to go. And I lost a few days each end just kind of getting the train back from Hong Kong, and because the ferry to South Korea only went twice a week. So I ended up with 11 days to do what turned out to be a bit more than 1,000 miles. And that at the time was one of the most challenging things I'd done. And it was also, I think I say this honestly, it's very hard to be objective, one of the most difficult things I've done, because within a couple of days of riding 100 miles a day on a fully loaded touring bike, I was exhausted, and then I had to keep going on top of that exhaustion. And I remember waking up some mornings and feeling as exhausted as if I had just finished a day cycling, but having to get going again. And just with this absolute knowledge that if I flagged and if I thought, oh, you know what, I'll finish early and do it tomorrow, if I didn't keep up my 100 miles a day, I was not going to make it. And I was going to end up getting into really serious trouble for overstaying my visa, and I was going to miss the boat, and it was all just going to be too much to cope with. So it was, even more than in a race, the pressure, like the psychological pressure of having to do it, was really hard. And I most certainly did not do China justice at that point. I remember seeing signposts for sort of various attractions as I went through Eastern China and thinking, I really should go and see that. That sounds great. And just knowing that I couldn't, I had to keep going.
I've spent the last few days reading through the book. I have to say, being here in lockdown, not being able to really get out of the house, it's been one of the most wonderful pieces of escapism. When you write a book like that, there is so much detail in there from going and doing the Transcon race. How do you remember, how do you record all of that detail, especially when you're going through so many highs and lows during a race? How do you remember all of that?
I think it just gets really imprinted in your brain. It's interesting because I get asked this quite a lot, and people generally say, well, you must have been taking notes as you went. And I wasn't. And I feel sometimes a bit guilty about the fact that I'm not a better journal keeper and note taker as I go. And I don't record audio or anything. I just let it all happen. But I think cycling in particular gets you into quite a specific mental space where you are more inclined to remember things. I think partly just because you have an awful lot of empty time. If you're cycling for 20 hours a day, that's 20 hours that your brain has to be doing something. And it gives you time to remember things and observe things and take them in. And I think you probably process things in a slightly different way. One thing I found is that I always generally think in words, and I'll be riding along and I might be, looking at what's around me and trying to figure out how I would describe, the light on the side of that mountain to someone who can't see it so that they could experience it. And that's really hard to do. So I'll try and, I'll workshop that in my head for a while and try and come up with some way of putting it that I think really, makes it come alive again. And if I manage that, I'll be quite proud. So I'll kind of, turn that sentence over a few more times. And what I often find is that is the note-taking, that is the first draft. And so if 6 weeks or 6 months later I sit down to write about this, that will all come tumbling out. And it's things like that. And it's also things like, I think about a lot of stuff when I'm riding along. I think about memories, things I've done before, rides I've been on. I think about future plans and ideas and fantasies and things that might happen. And I sometimes have imaginary conversations with people in my head. I think that helps with the remembering things. And then you've got all the prompts as well. I'm sure you know how you might be riding along and you see some particular thing. It reminds you of something and that sets off a train of thought. And then the following week you might ride past the same thing and it'll kick off the same train of thought. You kind of, what goes on in your head gets pinned to the landscape in various ways. And when I was recreating it all for the book, I did I went back and looked at all sorts of things like, older tweets and texts and photos I'd taken, anything that might have been happening then. And even just looking at things like Street View, I'd sometimes see, I'd be street viewing my way through a little French village and I'd see the tabac and I'd remember the ice lollies I bought there, how I sat on the ground outside and just little details like that. And it was amazing how a lot of stuff would come back that I hadn't even really thought of since then. So I think having all of those prompts as well, like going through all the mental processes of observing and recreating something, but having the geographical, spatial context to pin it to, which you wouldn't with everything. But with this, it was right there. I can go back to certain mountain passes in Europe and I've got a lot of thoughts there.
So within the book, you kind of go back quite a bit to that time when you were ascending Ventoux. I really love the bit where you talk about imagining this peloton of friends around you, like taking you up the mountain. But why is it that moment like holds so much weight for you within the book and within writing?
Why is it? I'm not sure. I think partly because it was something I'd already written. I wrote it up as a blog post not long after the race. And actually going back to the night itself, one of the more obscure strands of that very intense mental experience and life-changing period I was going through was this back of the mind knowledge that I was going to write about this one day, that what was going on and this experience I was having was a story I was writing and was something I was going to share. There were so many parts of it. There was the way I was connecting with the people I was thinking of to inspire me. There was the way I was imagining the world beyond myself and the way I was imagining, the world that was just right here around me. There were all the people I didn't yet know were watching me. And then there was this additional thing of, I think it was maybe this sense that I am going to bear witness to this. This is really hard and actually really awful, but I am going to take something from this that redeems it. And what I am constructing as I haul my way through this extraordinarily challenging experience is something that I am going to, is changing it from being this horrible drudgery. Once you recapture them and recount them, they gain a kind of, transcendence, I think is a word I've already used. And I don't want to say divinity, but it elevates the experience. And so going from that, on that night, knowing that this was an experience that would mean more in my life to come. And then I spent, I think it was a couple of days writing it up. It was a very long blog post. It was far too long for a blog post. And I knew it was really good and that it spoke to me a lot, but also crucially, I think it spoke to a lot of other people. And that, I'm rambling a bit here, but I think that's the crucial thing about having these experiences and then writing about them. you take this thing that was very personal and very introspective and self-absorbed, and then you kind of open it out and you find other people engage with it, and that kind of gives it its meaning. The first year of the 3 years I did the Transcon, that was the most significant moment, I think. Another thing I found in the long bike races is even if people don't actually know they're there, or you don't know they're there, it can still make a huge difference. And what I end up doing is thinking about all the people I know who inspire me and who keep me going. But I find out the next day that actually, unbeknownst to me, dozens and dozens of people had been dot watching me up the mountain. And I hadn't quite realised at that point just what a thing dot watching was. But the following day, I got all of these emails and texts and all sorts of and tweets saying, we were following you the whole way. And one guy said he'd actually, he'd gone into Street View for the last 5K, and he just clicked his way and followed me up the mountain because he wanted to be there riding alongside me. What I felt when I discovered that was it was almost as though in what I thought was a very solitary experience, all of these people had been just out of eyeshot, like just off in the darkness, just, you know, watching me and cheering me on, even though I didn't know I was there. They were there, rather. That's incredibly powerful. Like, it's something that has stayed with me and has come back to me again and again, and that I've used in all sorts of forms on long rides.
So during these races, there's a lot of talk about suffering or this kind of enduring or pain. And there does seem to be a lot written about that. I remember you reading in the book, you were saying that the guy, Leo, was messaging his girlfriend, Kate, saying that this was it. I don't want to be in this race anymore. It's too hard, kind of thing. But what is it, do you think, about putting yourself into that moment of like suffering or like that you enjoy about it? What is it that keeps taking you back to those moments, although putting yourself into those positions?
Possibly the purity of it and the simplicity of it. Like in a race like the Transcon, you have all sorts of, you know, ups and downs. You'll have long periods where it's kind of going quite well and you're riding well, covering distance. You'll have periods where it's dragging a bit. And then you'll have like a couple of hours, maybe every day, where you get to a really hard bit, like you're going up Mont Ventoux in the dark, or you've hit a gravel section, or it's raining and there's a headwind. You know, some time where it's really like, this has got tough and you've got to put your head down and push through it. And those are the bits I actually enjoy the most. And I know that sounds bizarre. They're the bits I dread and then look back on really fondly, because that's when you're most single-minded, and that's when it's obviously it's not easy, but it's simple. Nothing else matters because you don't have the energy to think about anything except the immediate need to keep going. It's great. It's when my life is kind of at its most kind of urgent and vibrant, and you are only in this moment. You are at your most alive. You are not sort of dispersing yourself throughout the past and the future and the probable and the possible. You're just there, pushing against whatever it is you're pushing against, and you're mustering all your energies into that. And then afterwards, you know, eventually you get over the mountain, or you get to the end of the race or whatever it is, and then everything gets a bit kind of, well, you know, that was good, but now I've got to worry about this and this. You just work with what you've got. Like, it's going to be hard anyway. If you're sleep deprived, it might be a bit harder, but you'll just do it. And that's really the easy bit. Once it's started, it's fine. You just keep going. It's the bit before and then the bit after that are hard. And with all the experience I have, I've now learned this. Like, I love doing big rides and runs, because you know at some point you're going to get to that moment where it's just you and the push forward.
That's another bit that I kind of really picked up on during reading the book as well, was we think about the actual event, or okay, like getting to the start line, that is a really nerve-wracking experience, and a lot of hard work goes into it before you even get to the start line. But we very rarely think about what happens post the finish line. And you write in the book about you having to deal with the kind of the darkness that comes after finishing an event such as the Transcontinental. And I remember you talk a lot in the book about, you aren't the only person that deals with that. You'd spoken with Mike Hall about it, and he had also admitted to that, having those kind of feelings. Like, are there ever moments where you are in that race and you kind of think, you know that you're going to come out to that darkness at the other side, and you think, is it worth it? Is what I'm doing really worth it? I mean, obviously you do, but are there moments where you question how you deal with that out the other side, or why you're putting yourself through it to know that you're going to come out the other side with it?
There are now. I think for the first few years of doing things like this, I was eventually aware that, you will have a dip after a big race, but I didn't really think about it. It was just like, oh, well, I guess that will happen. But the most important thing is the race. Now I do think about it. I plan after a big event. So now every summer, except this summer, I take a group around the Tour de France route, which is kind of similar in stature to doing the Transcon. It's very different in some ways, but you're as knackered afterwards. And I deliberately then plan in a month where I will not do anything. I'll do the minimum amount of work and I won't cycle. And I will feel rubbish for quite a lot of that month. And then if I am good and I stay off the bike and I do everything right, afterwards I'll feel a bit better and I can get back on. And then a month or so after that, I'll have a massive binge of cycling because I'm so fit and I've got all my, I've recovered and I'm not tired anymore. But I do now plan it. And if you don't, if you expect to go back to life as it was, then you will get into difficulties. And having to sacrifice a month of the year, I don't know. I mean, do I want to do that? Or should I do smaller rides and just keep going? And I do now have that conversation with me. I haven't always. There are quite a few years where I've just kind of, stumbled to the end of a race or a big ride and then just been clinically depressed for a month or more and not handled it well. And that is something that everybody just keeps saying, oh, we need to talk about this more. And we do now talk about it a bit more, but no one really has a solution. I think the solution is ultra sports are not good for life balance. And so you are going to sacrifice something if you do that. And I am usually happy to sacrifice it because of the sublime moments I will get during whatever it is I'm doing. But I think it's something that needs to be considered. For every yin there is a yang.
You said after you won the Transcontinental, the winning was that wasn't even the exhilaration or the bit that you took a real exhilarating moment from. What is it during that race that you are the moments that you hold on to that were the ones that gave you the most gratification from completing it?
It's a really funny question, this. I've been told my whole life, and I know I'm very, very competitive. I'm a very competitive person. So I've really puzzled over why I didn't just feel amazing to have won a race. It doesn't quite add up. And I've analysed it and thought, well, maybe there are a lot of different ways of being competitive, or just a lot of different elements to what we call competitiveness. Maybe it's a lot of things that we're lumping together into one word. Because I think I do enjoy competing and I enjoy pushing myself. I think as much against my own measure as against competitors. If there are competitors around, I will absolutely try to overtake them or have little secret vendettas in my head. But it's really much more about me. But then when you finish and when you win, you've almost undermined your competing because you can't compete anymore because you've reached the end of it. Maybe it was that. But then, what I got out of the race was most definitely not the winning, which is not how I expected. I had very different expectations for how winning a race might feel. But the bits I look back on fondly were, many, many, many parts. That's the thing. It was an incredibly rich 2 weeks because anyone who's cycle toured or cycled long distances in other countries will know what a rich experience it is. Like how many different things happen every day, how many different places you see and encounter, and all the different things you eat and the people you meet and the little, things that happen and the disasters and all of that. And in a race like the Transcon, you're doing maybe 300 or 400 kilometers a day. You're on the road maybe for 20 hours or more. So there's just that much more time for stuff to happen. More happened than I will ever have time to remember. That's the really weird thing. So I once, a couple of years afterwards, I was doing a very long ride. It was a Land's End John O'Groats in 4 days. So I was on the bike for quite a long time, had a lot of time to think, and it was winter, so it was dark for most of the time. And I decided on the final night, just to occupy my brain, to try and take myself through my memories of the Transcon that year and remember as much as possible about each day. And it took me hours and hours and hours, all night. It was a great way to pass the time. And I also felt a little bit wistful about it because I thought there's all these things that I haven't even thought about. since it happened, because so much happened in those 2 weeks. I mean, I've written a book about it, and the book is like 5% of what went on, really. There's so many stories that didn't make it into the book, and so many stories that I've not even remembered or told myself because there were so many. So there's that sense of great, great richness. And then there were just some really, really good moments, like so many beautiful roads. And sometimes, you know, you would find yourself riding into the sunrise or riding through the sunset or storming along on a sunny morning, you know, when you've finally found a coffee and suddenly everything is really falling into place, and feeling the amazing things that my body could do. Because I went through periods of great exhaustion and patheticness a lot. Like, I frequently thought, I am going so slowly and riding so badly, I don't even think I'm in the race anymore. This is embarrassing. But then there were occasional other moments where I would be legging it and thinking, I don't understand. I've been riding, you know, for a week almost without stopping. How am I going so fast? This is incredible. You know, I've gone so far into what my body can do, and I'm discovering all these new kind of repositories of energy. There was one morning, it was only a few days in, it was coming up to checkpoint 2 in Grindelwald, and I was riding along the side of the lake, Interlaken. And it was, you know, first thing in the morning, nice quiet road, a lake. The road was reasonably flat, and I was legging it. I was really, really going fast on the bar, the drops, error bars rather. I had my head down. I think I was singing quite loudly as well. And only after quite a while, I realised that some roadie was drafting me, which is embarrassing. And isn't the first time that's happened. But also the fact that I was going fast enough for a roadie to bother to draft me, like maybe 5 days into the race. Yeah, we so often focus on, you know, how we're not good enough and all the things we can't do. And sometimes you surprise yourself. And wow, I didn't think I was the sort of person who was capable of riding really fast and feeling really good about it. There were loads of little moments like that as well.
Do you think that how you talk about when you're doing a race like that, there's so many different details and things that happen, and do you feel like it's almost has like it's quite synonymous with the situation that we're all finding ourselves in at the moment, in the sense of that it slows life down. You become a lot more aware of what's going on, all the little things that happen, because you just are focused in that moment. We're all enduring something quite mentally. And even I know that if I stand on the balcony, I notice that there's a sound of traffic hasn't been there. So I could hear the sounds of different things on the street that I'd never listened to or heard before. It's a strange thing, and whether you feel like it's got any kind of synonymity with that or...
There are some ways in which it feels similar and some ways in which it feels very different. So at the moment, one of my struggles is with this feeling of aimlessness, like I don't have enough to do, I don't have enough purpose. And one of the things I found in races is that, and in fact, one of the things I miss after races is that you have an absolute purpose. Like, your purpose is just to keep moving. And I was told early on, if you're not riding or eating or sleeping, then you're wasting your time. And that became one of my checklists. It's like, you know, what are you doing at the moment? Are you doing one of those 3 things that contributes to the very, very basic task of just keeping going? And it was great. You don't really have to make very many decisions because you've just got this overriding priority. And I do wonder at the moment, like, maybe that's how I should be thinking. I don't have a permanent long bike ride to be doing over the next few weeks, but just keeping going is perhaps that's all we have to do. Perhaps that's it. And then another one of my sort of checklists, I guess, I got really into self-maintenance during the second year I raced the Transcon, the year I won. I realised that the way to keep going was to keep mind and body and bike roughly on a level. Like, if you have these massive fluctuations, you have great highs and then you have terrible lows. And when you have a terrible low and everything seems hopeless, that's when you're going to be looking for reasons to quit. And there are always some really good reasons to quit, because you have done something really stupid to yourself. You probably do have an injury. You probably should stop racing, but you're not going to. But when you're having one of these terrible lows, actually, they start to look like very sensible reasons to quit. So I kind of thought, right, I must make sure I don't ever get that bad. What it turned out to be was just getting to know myself and my rhythms really well, knowing that I always felt terrible at certain times of day and allowing for that. So in the afternoon, I would have a terrible dip after lunch and feel really miserable and slow and weak and think, what am I even doing here? And after a couple of days, this little voice was like, okay, well, you always feel bad at this time. So why don't you just slow down for a bit? You rode really fast this morning, so now just slow down and keep going. And then there were quite a few other things as well. I used to tell people it's like, it's a bit like when you have a new baby. Not that I know, but if it's crying, it's going to be one of like 5 or 6 things. It's going to be, it's too hot or cold, it's hungry, it needs to sleep, it wants its nappy changed. One of those things. So whenever I felt bad, or even if I didn't, I'd think, right, how are you doing? Are you dehydrated? Are you hungry? When did you last eat? How much sleep did you have? Does that relate to how you're feeling at the moment? And it could be either way. It could be I'd not had much sleep, so I was feeling rubbish. Or it could be I just did 6 hours in a hotel and I felt like Superman. But you need to be careful with that, because you can only feel like Superman for so long before you have another crash because you've overdone it. It was kind of little boring things like that, just keeping an eye on myself and keeping an eye on how I was going, which is my long-winded way of saying that is what I'm doing at the moment. You know, we're all having ups and downs. We're all having days where we wake up and feel just unaccountably low. And well, one of my ways of dealing with that is just knowing that I respond well to hitting targets. So thinking, right, I'm just going to make sure I do enough things today that when I get to the end of the day, I can think, great, I did this. I sent those invoices. I did my laundry and whatever else it is you need to do. But also just thinking, okay, have I eaten well? Am I well hydrated? Have I slept well? Have I, had social contact? Have I been outdoors? All just the little basic things that we need as human beings, as people and as ourselves, just to keep going through it.
Wouldn't it be beautiful if life could just be so simple that you had that three checklists, 3-prong checklist for the whole of life? And just like every day, you're like, am I cycling my bike? Am I sleeping or am I eating? If I'm not doing any of them, then it's not worth it. Just keep going. Oh, the simplicity of that would be beautiful. But maybe that's something.
Isn't that how it is?
Yeah, it should be, shouldn't it?
There is a certain excitement to having a clean slate, a blank page in front of you. Because I had quite a lot of plans for this year. I was booked up until at least like October. And now I don't at all. And I've got all that space to fill with whatever I want to fill it with. And I will, because, I always find something to do. So it might be that there's a massive log jam of events at the end of this year, because all the people running events will rebook their events for that time, and all the events that are happening will get totally full because everybody will want to go and do something. Or it might be that we all just come out and say, let's just go and ride our bikes a really long way. And there'll be a lot of that. I mean, I'm already planning where I might go when I can go for long rides again. And new things may come of this. Like, we don't know what yet, but periods like this are always hold the seeds of whatever is going to happen next.
Yeah.
And often you don't realise it.
Because I can imagine, like yourself, a lot of us are. So Lionel and I, at the end of the episode that we did last month of Explore, we actually talked about where we'd want to go, like what was the rides that we wanted to do. And before I'd even read your book, actually, I said on the last episode that Ventoux was where was one of the bucket list things that I wanted to go and do and tick off. So when I then read your book and you started talking about Ventoux, it was just like, oh wow, it really it kind of made that want to go and do it even more. But for anyone who's kind of like planning to do something where they go and do a long distance ride or a race, like what's kind of your advice for someone who's going into that kind of thing for the first time?
I think the basic thing would be, I hate it when people say just do it, but start doing it. Start doing small trips or, one-off day-long rides or weekends, and see how it goes and see what goes wrong. A good ride is a good ride, but a ride where something goes wrong is actually really helpful because it teaches you something about yourself or about your kit. And don't be afraid of things going wrong and failure, because it's fine. Like, most failures will not involve loss of life and limb. They will just involve getting wet feet or being really miserable for a few hours or being hungry. And those are all things that you can recover from and deal with and really, really learn from. So the first time I did the Transcon, I didn't know how you train for an event like that. So I just went and did loads of really long rides and thought, right, the more I suffer now, the less I'll suffer in the race, because I'll kind of have learned how it works. And it wasn't quite like that, because mostly it was really fun. But I just learned things like I always feel rubbish round about dawn when I've ridden all night, and I should not go and sit in a cafe for 2.5 hours feeling miserable. I should just have a coffee and keep going, and as soon as the sun comes up, I'll feel better. And things like, when you're worrying about how much to pack, go out for a night or two with the bare minimum and then slightly less, and see how you go. You might just get really cold and miserable and have to come home early, but you might realise you can do with less. And the more you've actually done it and gone out there, the less you will be like frightened and panicking and packing extra stuff, and the more relaxed you'll be. You know, when something comes up, you'll know you can deal with it. So I think experience is maybe the key thing, but it doesn't have to be years of experience of long distance bike tours and massive races. It can just be having been out for a weekend every month for the past year. You'll have a lot of different stuff that happens to you if you do that, and you can call on all of that. Most of them are the mistakes you'll make and the worst disasters. The main problem is just embarrassment and feeling really stupid, but I don't know if we've all been there, but I have.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport, fueled by science.
Thank you very much to Science in Sport, our longest standing sponsor. They've been with us since 2016 and enabled us to go to the Giro d'Italia and cover it daily for the Cycling Podcast. And, the support of both iwoca and Science in Sport have enabled us to bring the Explore series back this year on a monthly basis. It's been a strange start to the year, obviously, with so much of the cycling activity curtailed, but I'm sure that Science and Sport have been doing a roaring trade, because certainly when I was riding our Giro, I was finding that I was getting pretty dehydrated. Recovery was at a premium, really, after even just an hour or an hour and a half riding on the turbo. And Science in Sport are offering all of our listeners 25% off their products if you go to scienceinsport.com and enter the code SISCP25. They've got something for before your ride, during your ride and after your ride to keep you hydrated and fueled, whether you're racing or just, whether you're going fast or whether you're going slow, whether you're going a long way or whether you're just doing an hour on the turbo, as I was. I really enjoyed your interview there with Emily Chappell, Hannah. Interview. It was a conversation, really, wasn't it? And the thing that I took away from it was this sense of cycling as always having a purpose, whether you're a courier in the city who's got to deliver a parcel, or if you're doing the Transcontinental, there's always the next checkpoint or the next climb to get to the top of. And I've been thinking about that when I've been out riding, the sense of purpose that cycling gives you. Even perhaps it's been more heightened by the fact that we've all been indoors to a greater or lesser degree, but even when out riding a local loop, I'm thinking, well, shall I just add a bit on here? Shall I go left? Shall I go right? The kind of freedom of cycling, and it keeps you in the present, really. It's almost a physical form of mindfulness in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of thought that the way she explained about whether it was if she was riding, eating or sleeping, if she wasn't doing either of those three things, then there was no point of doing it, because it was not in making her progress forward. And the other thing I got from it, I mean, I enjoyed reading the book so much, because for me, whilst I was in the real kind of the peak lockdown in Spain during the time when I was reading it, and it provided me with such a real beautiful form of escapism, of just thinking about what was going to be that ride that I wanted to do, who I wanted to be out there on the road with again, with my friends and everything. And there's always that bit inside of you that you start to think, could I? when you think about a ride that you have in mind, or an event or some kind of challenge, and it kind of just starts to get that kind of your mind ticking over and thinking about all of those possibilities. And that's what I really, really enjoyed with it as well. And, you know, there's also this whole thing about endurance racing, that there's this kind of whole thing about the life balance. And she's very honest about the fact, saying that, you know, ultra events are not great for life balance. And there are certain things where she kind of thinks twice about going into now, about whether she would want to put herself necessarily through that. But the thing that I found really amazing was when she was talking about Ventoux, and obviously that is such a prominent part of the race for her, like it had a lasting effect in her mind and of the Transcontinental. The thing that I thought about it was the way she said that through the toughness of that moment that you're going through, she always knew that out the other side there would be something that she would take away from it and would stay with her. And I was just like, wow, that was like quite a profound thing. And I thought about, you know, it's that you're in that moment, but then actually you know that you're going to get something else lasting from it afterwards. So yeah, I would highly, highly recommend that book. It was a fantastic read. And she's a really, really great writer as well, actually.
Yeah, the book is called Where There's a Will. It's published by Profile Books, and it's available both as a hardback and as an ebook. So yeah, check it out. Ian, I wondered, when you were a pro racer, I sort of mentioned the physical mindfulness of cycling. What is there room for any thought when you're in the peloton? I mean, what is going through your mind when you're in the midst of a 200-kilometer race?
I think oftentimes you're just kind of you're making, personally, I would just like kind of make mental calculations of what's, you know, where I'm at and kind of what's coming up, you know, whether it's fueling, tactics, you know, objectives of the day. You know, I always had this, maybe not so strange, of like a tactic of like, you know, kind of considering my fuel tank, like, all right, we're, you know, halfway through the stage, have I used half of my, you know, my energy and effort? But yeah, I think, you know, when you look at these, I've spoken to a few ultra endurance athletes recently on my own podcast, and it's something that's completely different that I'm kind of starting to get into, but it's, you know, that's so much time to kind of be by yourself in your own head. And personally, it's somewhat frightening to me. I mean, I still tend to ride with headphones in. I actually was, grateful that you guys had our Giro, because I was able to, you know, keep me occupied while I was out riding the last month. But, you know, I think in a lot of these endurance events, you're really just by yourself listening to your own thoughts, and you can get really stuck in your head. But I think you can also learn a lot about yourself, you know, spending long miles out riding.
Yeah, it's easy to get into a downward spiral, I think, or certainly talking from personal experience. Harder to keep thinking positive thoughts, especially when it is getting hard, or the weather's against you, or you're starting to feel like it's all getting away from you a bit.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's the thing with Emily, though, where I thought was quite amazing, where she was saying on those endurance events, she would know that around sort of after lunch every day, kind of 3 or 4 p.m, she would have a low point, and that would be her moment where she would always go into a bit of a hole, and then she would start to get into a routine of realizing how to manage that. And so it was quite interesting that kind of, you spend a lot of time in your own head with your own body, but in another way, there's something that's really beautiful in the fact that you learn so much about your body and how it responds to things, and you start to know your mind a little bit more, which I guess, like, I understand your point there, Ian, where it's kind of a bit of a scary prospect as well, because sometimes maybe getting to know people's or your own mind a little bit can be a bit of a scary thing, but it's still quite an amazing thing how she's sort of taught herself how to manage that.
Well, when you're outdoors, you've also got the physical landscape to distract you. You can take in the scenery and those. If you're riding a route of your own choosing, or if you're navigating your way following a map, you're always sort of thinking about what you're actually doing. The mental aspect of riding indoors is something completely different. And Ian, you've spoken to somebody this month who really has bitten off quite a considerable challenge that must have been as mentally taxing as it was physically taxing. Who have you spoken to?
Yeah, so I spoke to Timothy Rugg, who actually is a former professional road cyclist. I think he's an American, but the only time we ever raced together was actually at Tour of the Alps. I think it was Tour of Trentino at the time, back in 2016. But yeah, I got in touch with him and he decided to do a virtual ride across America. I spoke with him going into the last few days, and it was... Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think the mental side of that is much more daunting than, the physical side. He at one point, in the podcast, you'll hear that he shared, he couldn't go to sleep at night because all he could hear was, the hum of the trainer in his head. And, he was by himself out in Arizona. And, despite just, all the physical, sides that go into preparing for an event like that and just participating and doing it, you have to think about all the, everything, laundry and eating. And it's just like the last thing you want to do is jump back on the bike after, 3 weeks of riding. And he completed the journey. But still something for myself that I look at and I think, that's a little bit crazy. Well, good morning. I'm here with Timothy Rugg. Actually, I'm not with you. I'm in Vermont. You're out in Arizona, but you're having your first sip of coffee of the morning. How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm feeling a little groggy this morning. This is day 10, and I'm starting to feel a little tired, more so every day.
Well, for listeners who aren't familiar with what you're doing, a couple of weeks back, you decided as part of the quarantine lockdown, you're a cyclist yourself. You thought that, you want to stay fit, stay active, raise some money for a good cause. So you have decided to do a virtual ride/race across America, and you're 10 days in now.
Yeah, totally. And I definitely want to put the emphasis on ride, because if it was a race, I would have probably be trying to do this as often as possible, but I am making sure I get a full night's sleep and other things to not make it too crazy right now. Just wanted to do something a little crazy to kind of portray the idea that if I can do this at home and get through a few weeks, it's something that anyone could do if they felt like they should. I wasn't trying to project the idea that people had to, but I wanted people to understand that there are other people going through it and it might help them if they see others doing it as well.
Well, you'd mentioned that this was a little bit of a crazy idea. I would say it's beyond crazy. It's a little bit absurd. I've been following along from a distance, and just some of your posts about what you're, physically and mentally going through. So you've fallen asleep a couple nights with just the sound of a trainer in your head, and obviously your undercarriage has seen better days, and numb hands and feet, and definitely a lot of kind of encounters that you've had that you probably didn't really foresee happening.
Yeah, people love the drama of things that are happening during something like this. So I wanted to share that, but I kind of had to curtail that a little bit because part of this idea was to stay healthy, stay home, and stay connected with each other. So I wanted to make sure that people knew that no matter how I went about this, there were going to be difficult things that were going to come up and things I had to figure out, which are great learning experiences for me if I ever wanted to go into a more endurance athlete, ultra endurance type setting. So I learned a lot from it, but I didn't want people to think that I was doing something incredibly unhealthy, because in a lot of ways, my body has started to normalize to it and I feel very healthy. Even today, I'm just tired because I had a big day yesterday.
Yeah, which is, it's not, you've ridden, 2,000 miles in the last 10 days. I don't think it's surprising that you're a little bit tired and fatigued.
Yeah, totally. I think each day's average between about 200 and 250 miles and about 10 to 12 hours of riding time. But the other thing that's going on here is, since I am self-quarantined, I'm actually all by myself. So I'm not just doing the 12 hours on the trainer. I'm having to cook my own food, do my dishes, do the laundry, and we're talking 3 to 4 sets of bibs a day. So it's a lot of laundry. It's a lot of dishes because it's a lot of food that I'm going through too. So it's a lot of work, and it ends up being a 15-hour day no matter how I try to do it.
Now that you've kind of started this process, and you obviously, when you come out of this and rest, you may be, as fit as you've ever been. Is that event something you've considered doing in the future now because of this?
Well, it's funny, like this kind of was a joke at first. I think the night before we had the stay-at-home order in Arizona, I was preparing to go out to try to tackle the famous Mount Lemmon KOM here in Tucson, Arizona. And then we got the stay-at-home order, and I had already been in quarantine, but I was like, this might be my last chance. But once that order came out, I was like, no, I can't. Like the optics of someone who is trying to represent certain things through their athletic endeavors might send the wrong signal to a friend or family member or someone. So I ended up not doing it. And then the joke I had been making about doing it virtually on the trainer across America quickly turned into a reality because I was talking about it. And I find that the more you talk about some things, the more they start to become a reality. So who knows? Over this past week, I've had a couple conversations with former sponsors like Science and Sport and Canyon and other charities like World Bicycle Relief. And the more conversations I have about what I'm doing, we start to turn the conversation into let's do it for real. Let's see what's out there. And even other people who may not have been interested in doing it before are interested in doing it. This whole situation is sparking a wave of curiosity amongst everyone. So who knows?
Yeah, well, you're not exploring outside. You're not seeing different areas. You're seeing a lot of Watopia, and I'm not sure which loops. I guess you're probably changing your loops every day just based off what Zwift puts up for you. But what have you explored probably more within yourself, spending 15 hours a day, not only by yourself, but also riding a bike for 12 of those 15 hours. You've probably gotten pretty deep into your head and into your body, just feeling things you haven't felt and emotions. What's that journey been like?
There's been some dark days and some hard times and times where I've had to really check my emotions at the keyboard because you can ride for a long time, but also trying to stay connected and engaged with the people you're riding with and for becomes difficult late into rides. And sometimes I get a little emotional just at the physical impact it's putting on my body and the chemical changes that are happening to me throughout the ride. So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of out of my control while I'm riding that I'm having to try to learn how to adapt to. That's been a really interesting thing to deal with. But honestly, the times that have been the deepest are when I actually get off the bike for my 5 or 10 minute break and step outside and just sit in the Tucson sun and just bake there for a minute without a shirt on so I can get as much vitamin D as possible and just drink my cold coffee or eat some rice and chicken that I had prepared already and just kind of stare at my little baby cacti in the front yard or listen to the birds in the trees. Just kind of being able to let myself have some time for peace during the day is a weird experience that I know we all try to look for, but it's never been so present as it is right now, I guess.
Yeah, when we've both raced bikes professionally, we actually raced together at Tour of the Alps. I think it may have had a different name at the time, but in 2015 or 2016 we raced there together?
I think it was 2017.
2017, maybe
but
it was.
Could have been 2016.
Yeah.
But it was definitely called the Tour of the Alps.
Yeah. So we raced there together, and that was when we first met. And I remember you were on Bike Aid at the time, and I was looking, just through the start list, and I saw there was an American on the team, and I was like, wait, there's an American on that team? And I didn't know. And we spoke in the race. You've continued to race, continued to go after all these, as you are now, somewhat crazy feats on a bike, all kind of tied to a cause. Your purpose of riding a bike and your motivation is different than most, where it's not driven by as much by results and fame and glory. It's due to a cause, and the reason of why we're riding bikes is much bigger than ourselves. What's been the biggest impact in what you've heard from followers on this current adventure?
Well, I hope the biggest impact is that people are starting to think what they can do rather than being told what they should do. In the beginning, my idea was not to necessarily pinpoint an organization for people to donate to, but to present a different one each day during my journey to give them an idea of what's out there and remind them that in this time of need, there are other people and communities in much greater need. So I even challenge some people to tell me who they are going to support, who they're going to bring awareness to or donate to, so that I can know more as well, but also to encourage them to be the ones leading the charitable giving, because that's what would most likely, in my opinion, continue a repeatable donation, repeatable action that they are owning up to rather than being told to do. So that's honestly what I'm hoping this can do the most, just through the structure that I've created through the campaign, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool that you've allowed people the ability to kind of identify organizations that mean something to them. I'm up here in northern Vermont, and we have a lot of dairy farmers, and obviously they are struggling right now with milk dumping. We just picked up 4 gallons of milk from the communities doing like a milk drive. I don't know what we're going to do with 4 gallons of milk, but in our area, that's a huge part of our economy that is definitely struggling right now. And obviously, based off where you live and your connections, different organizations are needing different help during this time.
Well, I'll tell you what, since you mentioned milk, I have drank 3 gallons of milk in the past 9 days. And I grew up as a milk drinker from the South. So I'd have 2 glasses of milk with dinner every night. I'd have milk with my cereal in the morning. I'd have milk at the cafeteria lunch. But then somewhere in my early adulthood, I probably stopped drinking milk for like 10, 12 years. But I felt that the quick fat, sugar, and protein ability of milk might be a welcomed addition to my program here, and it has been amazing. Cereal breaks are a highlight of my day.
Yeah, I have not been riding as much as you have, but still, I eat so much cereal, and we make some granola as well. And my wife sometimes gets a little bit upset with me when I finish a nice dinner and I just go straight to the cereal cabinet and pull out some cereal. Has that been like your quick go-to snack for, a short break between sessions?
Yeah, definitely. The cereal is just the easiest thing to do, and the chocolatier and sugarier, the more sweet it is, the better.
Yeah,
it gets me through it. It's just easy to go down, and it's just a bomb of carbs and protein.
What about your equipment? Because obviously, some bike component manufacturers recommend, changing your chain every 1,000 or 1,500 miles. Have you had to change or do any bike maintenance, or has everything been pretty stable because it's in a very controlled and clean environment indoors?
I've already gotten to the point where I understand that I'm going to have to replace the entire drivetrain on multiple bikes at the end of this. My chain hops all over the place at this point. If I'm trying to do anything, like I've jumped into a couple group rides just to mix things up and split my day up a little bit. And there's surges in these rides, and when I go to shift, I'll drop the chain. It'll go 3 gears instead of 1. So that's been tough to deal with, because if you bang your knee 50 hours into a training week, it's pretty rough. But the other thing that really snuck up on me on day 4, I think, I had a cleat come loose in my mountain bike shoes. And I had switched to my mountain bike shoes because the carbon sole on the road shoes was so hard that it felt like my feet were breaking. So I switched to my mountain bike shoes, which had a ton of flex, and it has been amazing. But one of the cleats came loose. And I noticed it because I started getting that feeling near my IT band and my knee that was like, uh-oh, this is a real injury coming on. I've got an overuse injury. I better stop. And then I unclip, and I see the cleat is just moving around freely. One of those things where it's hard to tell when you have a loose cleat while you're pedaling, because pedal strokes kind of feel fluid even whenever they're not. Even when you're pedaling squares, you wouldn't even tell if something was loose, really. So I was able to fix that and get things going again. But there's been little stuff like that all along. I mean, there's rubber burning off my front wheel from rubbing against the block of wood it's under.
Jeez.
I don't know how much rubber I have left on my front wheel that's not turning.
Yeah, you're going to have a flat tire.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take too much of your time because I know you got to jump on the trainer and get to it. So how can folks follow along on both this adventure and anything you're up to in the future?
I think the easiest way is Instagram at Timothy Rugg. There I have my Discord channel where I've been having special guests every day for this adventure. I hope I can integrate some more technology into some of my exploits in the future. Definitely need some upgrades to get there, but technology is the way right now, as we've seen with the virtual riding community and all the live feeds that are happening and all the world tour pros that are jumping into the virtual world. So who knows, there'll be a YouTube channel or something in the future if it's what the people want.
Yes.
Well, so many contrasting thoughts were going through my head listening to Timothy talk about that. Going through the number of bib shorts he was going through, and I was thinking about my, in comparison, puny hour or 90 minutes on the turbo, and sort of stepping off, wet through with the sweat of being indoors riding, and it was something I hadn't really thought. You must go through. Well, he said 3 or 4 sets of bib shorts a day, and they've all got to be laundered. He's got to keep his fueling going. But the big question, Ian, is what did you do with all of that milk, the 3 gallons of milk? I was thinking, in tribute to Al Giro, you could have made a giant panna cotta.
Well, I actually, after consuming all the milk, I had to do a little dairy detox. One week I had an entire gallon of yogurt. So we made a bunch of yogurt. I love burrata. I think that's probably one of my favorite cheeses, is like a fresh burrata with some tomato and mozzarella.
Great
so
choice.
I was looking at, making some, and I'm disappointed that you didn't make any cheese on your Giro al Ristorante, but I didn't have any rennet to actually make that. Maybe in the future, maybe this coming winter when I have a bit more time inside, I will get into some cheese making, because it's one thing here in the US. In Vermont, we have a lot of good hard cheeses, but there's not a great, it's difficult to find a good burrata.
Well, just on the ride across America, I mean, it's depending on the route you take, it's 3,000 miles, isn't it? 4,800 kilometers there or thereabouts. It's a long way to do outdoors, but certainly a long way to do indoors without moving anywhere. And somebody else who's taking on a similar challenge is our old friend and colleague Rupert Guinness, who's doing the virtual race across America from the 16th of June to the 28th of June, powered by the full gas platform. Again, Rupert has featured in Explore before. He was in the first series. He talked about riding across Australia, and he was hoping to ride across America in the actual physical event this year, but of course that has been cancelled because of coronavirus, and so he's doing the virtual event instead. Good luck to him, and we'll maybe catch up with how he gets on with that as well for a future episode. Sticking with extraordinary indoor cycling feats before we move on, you may remember a couple of episodes ago we heard from Jacob Hill-Gowing, who took on the task of riding 3,500 kilometres, the distance of the Tour de France, to raise money for The Big Issue, a magazine which supports homeless people. Now, homeless people were really badly hit by the coronavirus, and he wanted to raise money for that charity, and he did this ride on an exercise bike that, let's not be too unkind here, it's the sort of thing that you would get from a mail order catalogue, or in the UK a store like Argos. It's not a specialist cycling machine at all. We posted a picture of it on the Cycling Podcast Twitter feed a while back, and he wanted to raise £5,000 for the charity. He ended up raising £16,700 riding 3,500 kilometres on this exercise bike. And a big thank you to Ian Cleverley from Rouleur magazine, who saw the Tour de Flat hashtag on Twitter and sent Jacob some bib shorts. Basically, he'd been riding in kind of ordinary shorts, and the chafing, I think, was getting to him quite early on. So a couple of pairs of bib shorts were in the post to him. But well done. I mean, again, makes my puny effort of sort of an hour or so a day during our Giro feel pretty puny. But there we go. The sense of challenge is different for everyone, guys. So that's That's how I'm looking at it. Talking of challenges and cycling long distances, we're going to hear now from Dara O'Shea, who's a cycling podcast listener. And basically, we were put in touch with Dara when we heard that his ride from London to Singapore had been interrupted when he reached Malaysia at the start of March, and lockdown was basically curtailed his ride, and he went to Langkawi and had hoped to continue the rest of the journey. He set off from the UK last February, so he'd been on the road 13 months or so, and when I spoke to him, he was hoping to make it all the way to Singapore.
Okay, so my name is Dara O'Shea. I am a cyclist who's been on the road now for about 14 months. So I left home near London in February last year. And over the last year, I've ridden basically from London to where I am now, which is Malaysia. I'm in Langkawi, which is an island sort of just off the coast between Thailand and Malaysia on Peninsula Malaysia. And I've been here coming up on 2 months now, just stuck, basically. But I think there's many worse places to be stuck. But yeah, about 2 days after arriving here is when the lockdown in Malaysia kicked in, and I've been here since. So my goal was always to ride from London to Singapore. I gave myself about a year. I was working in an engineering job and quarter-life crisis, like many people, I think, and just wanted to go on an adventure. There was a few different options for routes to take or things to do. It was never definitely going to be a cycling trip, but as I researched more and more about how I wanted to travel, I thought cycling was going to be by far the most rewarding for what I wanted to get from it. This trip across Eurasia, for me, offered the best variety in terms of scenery and landscapes and culture and people and food and religion and all these different things to see. I thought in a 1 year period, this would be the route that offered the most. The goal is to get to Singapore, though the destination has never been the absolute 100% most important thing. You know, it's a long trip and it's about what you experience on the way, but I would like to get there. So now I'm very close, but sort of been hanging on to the hope it might happen and kind of coming around to the idea it might not be possible, but I'm kind of in this limbo situation of not sure what to do right now. I could do it in a week if I wanted to. Yeah, it's at that stage now. And for that reason, I feel quite lucky right now, to be honest, because I've met lots of other people just in the last few months who are just at the start of trips like mine. I met an Australian couple on the road in Thailand coming the other way who'd just done what I did a year ago. You know, they quit their jobs and they'd begun on this big trip they were planning to ride for 3 years and they've had to go home. So for me, I think the perspective is important. You know, I've been extremely lucky to be able to get as far as I've done, and all the things I hope to experience, I've pretty much been lucky enough to experience all of it. So there's obviously the possibility of going home, but it feels like a strange thing to do so close to where I wanted to finish. But if I do have to at some point, then I'm okay with it.
You described it as a quarter life crisis, and the bike wasn't necessarily the first idea. So what was it that led you to settle on a cycling trip across, you know, a great chunk of the world?
I did some reading, and there's a book written by someone called Alistair Humphreys. He's a British author who has done a round the world cycling trip himself. It's called The Grand Adventure. I guess reading that gave me the idea mostly. I was already a cyclist, sort of a road cyclist, and had done some European events like the Étape and stuff, and I did a lot of road cycling. So it was always there. I knew it would be something I could probably physically do, but I had never really thought about the rest of it. And reading his book and then getting more and more interested in the concept, I kind of became aware of what was possible to do by bike and all of these routes and all of these possibilities, and that I hadn't really considered. But I guess what shined out from all of it was the way that the bicycle gets you to experience a country, because you don't have a typical experience that you would have traveling by any other means. When you visit countries in a more traditional way, like using buses and trains and cars and things, you tend to see major centers and you miss what's in between. And with the bike, it's the complete other way round. I mean, the thing that defines your time in the place you're in is all of this in between and the places that you normally miss. and the interactions you have with people along the way and the vulnerability of it, because often I ride alone, sometimes not, but often you're quite vulnerable in the position you're in. You know, you're a person on a bicycle and you need to ask for help. You need to ask if you can have a place to sleep. You need to ask people for things all the time. And you end up really relying on just the kindness of people along the way and all of these things that really define your experience.
I imagine there's a certain points a sort of sense of obligation to ride with somebody else if they're going your way, but then you're surrendering a little bit of your own timetable as well, perhaps especially in the sense of sort of pacing or how far you want to go each day, or whether you want to go, you know, quite that direction or this direction. I mean, it's a strange one to me, that, because I've done a couple of rides where I've ended up with somebody and I've thought, a couple of days was fine, but then I'll probably be okay on my own again now. It's a strange thing, that.
Yeah, it is. And it's more difficult than if you're backpacking or if you're traveling or if you're just finding friends in life. You don't have so many boxes to tick. But finding someone that you can actually be an adventure cyclist or cycle tourist, whatever you want to call it, finding a partner for that is difficult. It's a Venn diagram with a lot of things that need to meet in the middle and come together and be that person who you can travel with long term. There's the distance per day and the speed question, which is important because I think any cyclist will recognize you need to be able to go at your pace that you're comfortable with, not too slow, not too hard, to really enjoy it. And then there are all the other questions of route, whether you'd prefer to be alone or with someone else at that time, the freedom aspect, how adventurous do you want to be versus how much would you prefer to keep as safe as possible, all sorts of different things. It's not always perfect, and I think part of what makes finding a good partner to ride with on a trip like this is to be able to recognize that.
In the grand scheme of things, you're right in, you're within striking distance of your intended destination. What's the situation now? It's the 1st of May today as we speak. Is there any indication as to when you might be able to get moving? And are you of the mindset that as soon as you're able to travel and move on, that you will do and make it all the way to Singapore?
I would love to keep going, and I would love to make it to Singapore. I guess when you're on a trip like this, I've pictured myself arriving there so many times that I really do want that to happen. But there is a much bigger and much more important question of whether it's responsible to do that. I would not want to do any riding if it seemed it was going to increase the risk of spreading this virus or that it was going to put anyone in danger. So that's the biggest question, I think, is there going to be a point in the near future when that becomes acceptable? When I was in Chiang Mai and we first started to hear about it, my friend Ben, who lives in Singapore, was with me at the time he came to visit. I was like, Ben, it's going to be so ironic if I get all the way to that Singapore border and they don't let me in. And at the time I said it, I was like, well, that's a funny thing to think about, but it's not. Of course, it's not going to happen. But now it seems like possibly is the most likely end to the story. So we'll see. Yeah, this is the point, is a trip like this, an experience like this is never just about, can you tick the box to say, yes, I finished the thing I said I would do, because the point was never to get there. The point was to have all the experiences along the way and all of the learning and all of the people you meet and all the things you see and the food and all this stuff. And maybe I have to fly home a little bit earlier than I expected, but to be upset about that instead of being happy you got to have this travel would be a crazy way to look at it, I think.
So that was Dara O'Shea, who'd been on the road riding from the UK towards Singapore and had got to Malaysia when the coronavirus meant that there was a lockdown. And we heard this week that he was preparing to fly home to the UK, wasn't going to make it to Singapore, unfortunately. But, I mean, if you make it that far, you're virtually there anyway. Once you've reached Malaysia, it's just relatively speaking, a short hop down to Singapore. So it's still a pretty mind-blowing trip. But I'm not surprised that he's a little bit disappointed not to have made it the whole way, but relieved to be on the flight home to the UK. But there must be other people out there whose riding has been curtailed because of the coronavirus and have had to make their way home. rather than sort of carrying on. And well, once the world starts opening up again, I'm sure people will be planning their trips. I know I'm certainly looking forward to doing some sort of ride for Explore in July. Hannah, have you made your plans for the trip to Mont Ventoux yet?
I have put in from my address to Ventoux in Google Maps so far and found out how far it is. About 530 kilometers. So I've just got to try and work out when the borders open, potentially races starting again, what my calendar's going to look like. When are you going to plan on doing yours, actually? Oh, you're staying in the same country, though. So the UK, you're fine. You don't have to worry about crossing a border. Apart from, like, the Watford Junction one, maybe, to go north.
It's Watford Gap.
Oh, Watford Gap. Sorry.
Yeah, not Watford Junction. God, you're as bad as Daniel Freeb. Ian, what have you got on the agenda for the immediate future?
Well, I will participate in a few more of the DIY gravel series that Ted King is putting on. Just this past week, my wife and I picked up a cheap, actually it's a dog bike trailer, and we're actually looking at doing some bike packing. I know pulling a trailer is not traditional bike packing, but it's what we have. And so, yeah, campgrounds are starting to slowly open up here. So I think we're going to stay within the state of Vermont. And yeah, I'll bring my wife along so she can ride her bike, and I'll be pulling a dog trailer full of our camping gear. So we're looking forward to, we always love camping, but I always have like a difficult time when we drive to a campsite because I want to ride my bike. So now we can, jump on our bikes and go bike packing with a little dog trailer pulled behind us.
Just lastly, Ian, just explain a little bit more about how the DIY gravel events are going, and also just remind us where we can listen to your podcast.
Yeah, so the DIY gravel can be found at IamNotTedKing.com. So like I said, it's just essentially a way of getting folks who had planned on doing these gravel events in the U.S. kind of still connected and staying involved. And, a lot of people have trained all winter to prepare for these events, and then the events got pulled. So a way of continuing to kind of share your experience with other people. In my most recent episode of Breakfast with Boz, served by Wahoo, I spoke with the 2019 winners of Dirty Kansas, Amity Rockwell and Colin Strickland. And before that, I actually did speak with the crew who did the Roam Free video with Wahoo on the South Downs Way. So something that you two are probably more familiar with than I am, but they did a bike pack trip down the South Downs Way. So it's an awesome video. You should go check it out. There's Sean Yates does the intro to the video, and I can hardly understand a word he says, but it's pretty inspiring to have an opportunity to see something like that and get inspired to get back out on our bikes and ride.
Amazing. I rode the South Downs Way in probably about 1992 on a mountain bike. That would be about right, 91 or 92. Beautiful ride through the south of England. And, Sean Yates is from down that way. He's a man from the south of England. But Explore will be back next month with, we don't quite know what yet. We'll put something together, and we'll reconvene then. But until then, thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you, Lionel.
And thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Lionel.